The familiar clang of steel under my boots echoed up the tower as I climbed the 70 steps to my home for the next 3 weeks. Each footfall on the metal grating felt like shedding another layer of city stress, leaving behind the honking horns and exhaust fumes of Seattle for something cleaner. By the time I reached the small cabin perched at the top of Cascade Ridge Fire Lookout, my shoulders had already started to relax. I pushed through the door and breathed in the smell of old wood and dust that had accumulated since my last rotation ended in September. The cabin measured maybe 12 by 12 feet, with windows on all 4 sides offering a panoramic view of the North Cascades wilderness. Dense forests of Douglas fir and western red cedar stretched in every direction, broken only by distant ridgelines and the occasional glimpse of snow-capped peaks. 8 years of this job, and I still got the same sense of relief when I closed that door behind me. Out here, the closest neighbor was David Cooper, stationed 15 miles south at Mount Pilchuck Lookout. Everyone else was at least a 40-minute drive down winding forest roads, assuming the roads were even passable. I dropped my duffel bag next to the narrow cot and started unpacking the essentials. Clean clothes went into the small dresser. Food supplies filled the compact pantry. My personal gear, extra binoculars, camera, books, found their usual spots around the cabin. The routine felt automatic after all these years, muscle memory taking over while my mind wandered. Fire season officially ran through October, but these late shifts were usually quiet. Most of the serious fire danger had passed with the end of summer's dry heat. Still, the state kept lookouts staffed until the first substantial rains arrived, which meant I'd be scanning empty forest for 3 weeks, radioing in the occasional false alarm when morning fog caught the light wrong. The work suited me perfectly. No meetings, no deadlines, no small talk with coworkers who didn't understand why anyone would choose isolation over the constant buzz of civilization. Just me, the forest, and the simple task of watching for smoke. As the afternoon faded toward evening, I set up my equipment on the desk that ran along the cabin's north side. The powerful binoculars went on their tripod mount, positioned for easy swiveling between quadrants. My logbook opened to a fresh page, pen ready to record anything worth noting. The radio console came alive with a burst of static as I switched it on and adjusted the antenna. I keyed the microphone and spoke into the familiar silence. "Mount Pilchuck, this is Cascade Ridge. Radio check." David's voice crackled back almost immediately, warm and slightly amused. "Well, well, the hermit returns to his mountain fortress. How's the view from your ivory tower, James?" "Same as always. Trees, trees, and more trees. Shocked to report that nothing burned down while I was gone." "Give it time. You've only been up there for what, 2 hours? That's got to be some kind of record for you staying out of trouble." I leaned back in the folding chair and checked my watch. Nearly 6 o'clock, which meant David was probably settling in for his own evening routine. "Everything quiet on your end?" "Dead quiet. Had a false alarm yesterday morning when some yahoo decided to burn brush without checking burn restrictions first. Rangers sorted it out before I even finished filling out the paperwork. Living the dream. You know it. All right, hermit. I'll let you get back to communing with nature. Check in tomorrow around 1800. Copy that. Cascade Ridge out." The radio went silent, leaving me alone with the endless expanse of forest spread out below. I pushed back from the desk and walked a slow circuit around the cabin, scanning each quadrant through the windows. Northwest, dense old-growth forest rolling toward distant peaks. Northeast, a patchwork of logging cuts from the 80s, now thick with second-growth timber. Southeast, the general direction of Mount Pilchuck, though David's tower was too far away to see even with binoculars. Southwest, more dense forest leading down toward the main access road, invisible beneath the canopy. Nothing moved except the occasional bird and the constant sway of treetops in the evening breeze. No smoke, no unusual activity, no sign that anything existed beyond these trees except the two of us, perched in our respective towers like sentries watching over an empty kingdom. I settled into the evening routine that had become second nature over 8 years of rotations. Dinner from a can heated on the small propane burner, a thorough scan of all quadrants through binoculars, noting anything that seemed different from my last shift. Entries in the logbook recording weather conditions, visibility, and the complete absence of anything worth reporting. The sun disappeared behind the western ridgeline sometime after 8, leaving the forest bathed in the purple twilight that preceded true darkness. I switched on the cabin's LED lantern and continued my periodic scans, though visibility dropped to almost nothing once full darkness arrived. The forest became a black void punctuated only by the occasional flicker of starlight through gaps in the canopy. By 11:30, I was ready to call it a night. One more complete scan of the forest, then I'd log the evening as uneventful and try to get some sleep before the early morning check-in with headquarters. I positioned the binoculars on their mount and started with the southwest quadrant, sweeping slowly from left to right across the dark expanse of trees. Nothing. Southeast quadrant showed the same empty darkness, no sign of David's tower or any other human presence. Northeast looked equally vacant, the second growth areas indistinguishable from the old forest in the darkness. I swung the binoculars toward the northwest quadrant and started the same methodical sweep. Dense forest filled the view, black shapes of Douglas firs stretching down into the valley and up the opposite slope. I'd covered maybe half the quadrant when something caught my eye. A soft blue glow flickered between the trees, maybe 3 miles out in the valley. I stopped sweeping and focused on the spot, adjusting the binoculars' focus to get a clearer view. The light pulsed gently, appearing and disappearing behind the tree trunks as if someone was moving through the forest with an unusual lantern. I watched for several minutes, trying to get a better sense of what I was seeing. The light seemed too bright and too blue to be a typical camping lantern, but it wasn't steady enough to be a downed power line. Could be hikers using some new type of LED gear, though it was an odd location for camping. The area was thick, old-growth forest with no established trails or camping sites that I knew of. The light continued its gentle pulsing, occasionally disappearing completely before reappearing in roughly the same location. No obvious pattern to the movement, nothing that suggested emergency signals or distress. Just an unexplained blue glow deep in the forest where most people would never venture. After about 20 minutes, the light vanished and didn't return. I kept the binoculars trained on the spot for another 10 minutes, but saw nothing more than the usual darkness of the forest canopy. I opened my logbook and made a brief entry. 23:45. Unusual blue light observed in northwest quadrant, approximately 3 miles out. Duration, checked 20 minutes. Possible camping activity. I closed the book and rubbed my eyes, already tired from the long day of travel and setup. Probably just campers with some fancy new gear, though it seemed like an odd spot to set up camp. The area was dense enough that even experienced hikers usually stuck to the established trails rather than bushwhacking through old growth. Still, people did strange things in the wilderness, and it wasn't my job to question their camping choices as long as they weren't starting fires. I switched off the lantern and made my way to the narrow cot, already looking forward to the deep sleep that always came easier in the tower than anywhere in the city. Outside the windows, the forest had returned to its normal darkness, giving no hint that anything unusual had ever been there at all. I'd spent the day going through familiar routines, weather observations, radio checks with headquarters, periodic scans of the forest, but found my attention kept wandering northwest. Not intentionally, just a subconscious pull toward that section of forest where I'd seen the strange light the night before. The rational part of my mind had already filed it away as unusual camping gear. People brought all kinds of new technology into the wilderness these days. LED lanterns that could probably be seen from space, portable solar chargers, GPS devices that blinked and flashed like small beacons. Still, something nagged at me about the location and the way the light had behaved. Evening settled over the forest with the same peaceful quiet as always. I completed my standard rotation of the cabin, checking each quadrant through the windows as daylight faded. Nothing moved except the endless sway of treetops in the evening breeze. David's radio check came through right on schedule at 6, the same easy banter about quiet shifts and empty forest. By 11 o'clock, I'd finished my routine observations and was preparing for the final scan before sleep. I told myself I wasn't specifically looking for anything unusual, just completing my normal security sweep. But when I positioned the binoculars and started with the southwest quadrant, I moved through it faster than usual. Southeast, northeast, quick, methodical sweeps that covered the required territory without really focusing. Then I reached the northwest quadrant and slowed down. I found myself checking my watch as I aimed the binoculars toward the area where I'd seen the light, 11:28, close to the same time as the night before, though I tried to convince myself that was just coincidence. At exactly 11:32, the blue glow flickered to life between the trees. My hands tightened on the binoculars as I focused on the same spot, maybe 3 miles out in the dense forest. The light pulsed with that same soft rhythm I'd observed the night before, but tonight I was watching more carefully. This wasn't the warm, yellowish glow of a camping lantern or the harsh white beam of an LED flashlight. The blue was too pure, too intense, with an almost electric quality that seemed to cut through the darkness instead of just illuminating it. I adjusted the focus and tracked the light's movement between the trees. Campers moving around a site would create random patterns. Trips to gather firewood, visits to the edge of camp, people walking back and forth doing evening tasks. This light moved differently. Small, deliberate patterns that repeated every few minutes. A slow circuit that covered maybe 50 yards, then a pause, then the same circuit again. No voices carried across the distance. No other lights appeared to indicate multiple people or normal camping activities. Just that single blue glow making its measured patterns through the old-growth forest. I lowered the binoculars and rubbed my eyes, trying to think of logical explanations. Some kind of new camping technology I wasn't familiar with. Maybe a solar-powered device that charged during the day and provided area lighting at night. Or hikers using specialized equipment for night photography or wildlife observation. But the location bothered me more tonight than it had the night before. I reached for the topographical maps I kept in the desk drawer and spread them across the workspace. My finger traced the contour lines northwest from the tower, counting distance and elevation changes until I found the approximate location of the light. Dense, old-growth forest, just like I'd thought. The kind of terrain that had never been logged because it was too steep and too remote to make economic sense. The trees there would be massive Douglas firs and western red cedars, some probably 4 or 5 feet in diameter, creating a canopy so thick that even daylight barely reached the forest floor. I traced my finger across the map looking for established trails or camping areas. The nearest marked trail was the Pacific Crest Trail, but that ran more than a mile east of where I'd seen the light. No designated camping spots, no old logging roads, no indication that anyone had any reason to be in that particular section of forest. Yet there it was, pulsing steadily through the trees like some kind of beacon. I considered keying the radio and checking with David. He'd been working these mountains longer than I had and might know about some unofficial camping spot or trail that didn't show up on the maps. But something held me back. The light wasn't creating any fire danger, wasn't threatening anyone or anything. It was just unusual. David would probably suggest the same explanations I'd already considered, and I'd end up sounding paranoid over what was most likely nothing. The light continued its patient circuit through the forest, appearing and disappearing behind the massive tree trunks. I found myself timing the pattern, roughly 4 minutes for a complete cycle, then a pause of maybe 30 seconds before starting again. Too regular for random human movement, but not mechanical enough to be some kind of automated device. I opened my logbook and wrote a more detailed entry than I'd managed the night before. Date, time, exact coordinates based on the topo map, duration of observation. I noted the light's color, intensity, and movement pattern, the absence of other typical camping indicators, the remote location, and lack of trail access. As I wrote, part of my mind was already planning tomorrow's observations. If the light appeared again, I'd have 3 nights of data to compare, patterns or changes that might help explain what I was seeing. Maybe I'd even consider hiking down there during daylight hours to check the area more closely, though 3 miles through old-growth forest wasn't exactly a casual afternoon walk. The light vanished at 12:28, nearly an hour after it had first appeared. One moment it was there, making its slow circuit between the trees, and the next moment the forest had returned to normal darkness. No gradual dimming, no indication that whoever was responsible was settling down for the night. Just an abrupt end to whatever had been happening out there. I kept the binoculars trained on the spot for another 15 minutes, but nothing reappeared. The forest looked the same as it did every other night, an endless expanse of black shapes under a star-filled sky. As I prepared for sleep, I found myself glancing toward the northwest windows more often than usual. Not expecting to see anything, just checking. The kind of unconscious monitoring that had become second nature after 8 years of fire watch, extended now to include something that probably wasn't my responsibility to monitor at all. I switched off the LED lantern and made my way to the cot, but sleep came slower than usual. Every time I started to drift off, my eyes would open and turn toward the windows facing northwest, scanning the darkness for any sign of that blue glow. The forest remained quiet and dark, giving no hint that anything unusual had ever been there at all. The third night felt different before it even began. I'd spent the day checking and rechecking my equipment, making sure the high-powered binoculars were clean and properly calibrated. My hands had been steadier during routine equipment maintenance in my early days on the job, but 8 years of firewatch work had taught me that some situations demanded extra care. Tonight, I needed to see clearly. I'd positioned everything on the desk by 10:30, giving myself more than an hour before the light typically appeared. The powerful binoculars sat mounted on their heavy tripod, already aimed toward the northwest quadrant, where I'd now seen that blue glow 2 nights running. My logbook lay open to a fresh page, pen ready to record whatever I discovered. The topographical maps remained spread across the workspace, marked with my best estimates of the light's location. 2 nights of watching had established a pattern that felt too consistent for random camping activity. The timing, the location, the behavior, none of it matched anything I'd seen in 8 years of fire watch. People didn't camp in that terrain. They couldn't access it easily, and they definitely didn't have reasons to stay there multiple nights running the same circuits through trees that barely let in daylight. By 11:15, I had the binoculars focused on the exact spot where the light had appeared both previous nights. The forest looked the same as always in the darkness. Massive shapes of Douglas firs and western red cedars creating an impenetrable wall of black. No movement except the constant sway of branches in the evening breeze. No indication that anything lived out there except the usual collection of deer, raccoons, and small night creatures that called the old growth home. I checked my watch again. 11:28. Still early based on the previous pattern, but close enough that I found myself holding my breath during each sweep of the binoculars. The anticipation felt wrong, like I was looking forward to something I should want to avoid. At exactly 11:45, the blue glow flickered to life between the trees. This time I was ready for it, binoculars already trained on the location and focused for maximum clarity. The light appeared in the same general area, maybe 3 miles out in the dense forest, but tonight I could see details that had been invisible during my previous observations. The blue glow wasn't coming from any device or campfire. No lantern or LED could produce that particular quality of light, too pure, too intense, with an electric brightness that seemed to cut through the darkness rather than simply illuminating it. As I fine-tuned the focus, trying to get the clearest possible view, my stomach dropped. The light source was moving between the trees in a way that made no sense. I adjusted the binoculars again, tweaking the focus until the image became as sharp as the equipment allowed. What I saw made my hands start to shake on the tripod handles. The light was coming from something that looked like a tall, unnaturally thin, humanoid figure. Its limbs were elongated far beyond normal human proportions, arms that hung too long and legs that seemed to stretch impossibly as it moved through the forest. 2 bright blue points of light glowed where its eyes should be, creating the beacon I'd been tracking for 3 nights. The thing stood nearly 8 feet tall, moving through the dense old growth with a jerky, unnatural gait that reminded me of stop-motion animation. Each step looked deliberate but wrong, as if the creature was learning how to walk or operating limbs that didn't quite belong to it. The blue glow from its eyes cast enough light to silhouette the rest of its form, revealing proportions that shouldn't exist in anything that walked upright. I watched it navigate between tree trunks that should have been impossible to pass through for something that size. The Douglas firs in that section of forest grew 4 and 5 feet in diameter, creating natural barriers that would force normal hikers to take wide detours. But this thing moved in straight lines, somehow fitting through gaps that looked too narrow even from 3 miles away. The most horrifying part wasn't its size or its impossible movement through the trees. It was the way it suddenly stopped moving and turned directly toward my tower. Despite the distance, 3 miles of dense forest and elevation changes, I felt absolutely certain the thing was looking straight at me. Those blue points of light seemed to pierce through the darkness and the miles between us, creating a connection that made my skin crawl and my breathing shallow. The sensation was like being examined by something that understood exactly what it was seeing, even though logic insisted that was impossible. I lowered the binoculars for a moment, my heart hammering against my ribs hard enough that I could feel the pulse in my throat. The rational part of my mind tried to offer explanations, trick of light and shadow, some kind of optical illusion created by looking through high-powered lenses at unusual angles. But when I raised the binoculars again, ready to document whatever I was really seeing, the light was gone. The forest had returned to its normal darkness, as if nothing had ever been there at all. My hands shook as I grabbed the radio microphone, almost dropping it twice before getting a solid grip. The image of those blue eyes looking directly at me burned in my mind, and I needed to tell someone what I'd seen, before I convinced myself it had been some kind of hallucination. I keyed the microphone and tried to keep my voice steady. "Mount Pilchuck, this is Cascade Ridge. David, you there? Over." Static filled the cabin for several long seconds before David's groggy voice crackled through the speaker. "Jesus, James, what time is it? This better be good, man." "David, I need you to listen to me. I saw something in the forest tonight, something that—" I paused, trying to find words that wouldn't make me sound completely crazy. "Something that doesn't make sense." Okay. His voice became more alert, though I could hear him moving around, probably checking his watch. "What kind of something? Fire? Injured hiker?" "No, not that. There's been this blue light out in the northwest quadrant for 3 nights now. Same spot, same time. I thought it was campers at first, but tonight I got a clear look at what was making it." David's radio stayed quiet for a moment. "And?" "It was tall. Really tall, maybe 8 feet. Moving through the trees like it wasn't human. The light was coming from its eyes, David. 2 bright blue points that looked right at me." "Whoa, slow down." David's tone had shifted from sleepy concern to the careful voice people used when they thought someone might be having a breakdown. "You're saying you saw something with glowing eyes?" "I know how it sounds, but I'm looking through high-powered binoculars. This thing was massive, with arms that hung almost to the ground. It moved wrong, like it was learning how to walk. And when it turned toward the tower, I felt like it knew exactly where I was." "James, buddy, take a breath. Could it have been someone in a costume? Maybe some college kids trying to mess with the fire towers?" wouldn't be the first time. I ran my free hand through my hair, frustrated that he wasn't understanding. A costume that makes someone 8 feet tall, moving through old-growth forest in the middle of the night? David, this thing was 3 miles out in terrain that would challenge experienced hikers in broad daylight. What about an animal? Sick bear reflecting your flashlight beam. Sometimes when animals are diseased, they behave strangely. The eyes could have been cataracts or some kind of infection that made them reflective. I wasn't using a flashlight. The light was coming from the thing itself, and bears don't walk upright for extended periods. This was walking like a person, but wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The radio stayed quiet for almost a minute before David's voice came back, more thoughtful now. Look, I don't know what you saw out there. Could be a lot of things. But if there's someone or something moving around in that area, I'll keep an eye out on my end. Maybe check with the rangers tomorrow about any unusual reports. You think I'm seeing things? I think you've been alone up there for 3 days watching empty forest, and sometimes isolation can play tricks on your mind. But I'm not dismissing what you're telling me. If something's out there, we'll figure out what it is. Thanks, David. I know it sounds crazy. Hey, we've all seen weird stuff in these mountains. Remember that summer when I kept reporting lights near the old mining claims? Turned out to be teenagers with dirt bikes and LED strips, but it looked like UFOs through binoculars. Yeah, maybe you're right. Get some sleep, James. Check in with me tomorrow evening and we'll talk more about it. If you see anything else tonight, call me immediately. Will do. Cascade Ridge out. I set the microphone back in its cradle and leaned back in the desk chair, trying to process David's responses. His skepticism was reasonable, even expected. I'd probably react the same way if he called me with a story about 8-foot-tall creatures with glowing eyes. But the rational explanations felt hollow when measured against what I'd actually observed through the binoculars. I tried to settle into the cot, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those blue points of light turning toward me. The image replayed with perfect clarity, and each time it felt more real rather than less. Whatever I'd seen out there had possessed an intelligence that no sick animal could fake. Every few minutes, I found myself getting up and checking the northwest windows. The forest looked normal in the darkness, just the usual collection of black shapes under a star-filled sky. No blue glow, no movement except the constant sway of treetops in the evening breeze. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from between those trees, waiting for me to let my guard down. Around 4 in the morning, I was checking the windows again when I spotted it. The blue glow flickered to life in the northwest quadrant, but this time it appeared much closer than before. I grabbed the binoculars and focused on the light, my stomach dropping as I realized the distance had changed significantly. What had been 3 miles away for the past 3 nights was now maybe 2.5 miles from the tower. The thing had moved closer. I tracked the light as it moved between the trees with that same unnatural gait I'd observed earlier. From this distance, I could make out more details of its movement, the way it stepped around massive tree trunks without seeming to slow down, the jerky motion that reminded me of stop-motion animation. Most disturbing was how purposeful its movement seemed, as if it was following a specific route rather than wandering randomly. The light pulsed steadily for about 15 minutes before disappearing again, leaving me staring into empty darkness with my heart hammering. I kept the binoculars trained on the spot for another hour, but nothing reappeared. The forest had returned to its normal quiet, giving no hint that anything unusual had ever been there. Sleep became impossible after that. I spent the remaining hours until dawn sitting at the desk, alternating between watching the northwest quadrant and checking my equipment. The radio remained silent except for occasional static bursts. My logbook lay open to a fresh page, but I couldn't bring myself to write anything yet. How do you document something moving toward you in the darkness? As the first pale light began filtering through the forest canopy, I positioned my strongest set of binoculars and began a systematic scan of the area where I'd last seen the blue glow. Daylight revealed the same dense old-growth forest I'd been looking at for 8 years. Massive Douglas firs and western red cedars, creating an impenetrable wall of green that stretched for miles in every direction. But as I fine-tuned the focus and swept slowly across the terrain, I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the binoculars. Several of the tallest trees in that section of forest showed obvious damage to their upper branches. Broken limbs hung at unnatural angles, and gaps in the canopy suggested that something large had passed through with enough force to snap branches that were probably 6 or 8 inches in diameter. The damage formed a rough line through the forest, as if something tall had pushed through without regard for the obstacles in its path. I traced the line of broken branches with the binoculars, following the destruction from roughly where I'd first spotted the light 3 nights ago to the area where it had appeared this morning. The path was unmistakable once I knew what to look for, a corridor of damaged trees that showed something had been moving through that forest, something tall enough to break branches 30 or 40 feet off the ground. The evidence that something physical had been moving through that terrain made my encounter feel frighteningly real. Whatever I'd been watching wasn't a trick of light or an optical illusion created by looking through binoculars in the darkness. Something large and powerful had been breaking its way through old-growth forest, and each night it was getting closer to my tower. I lowered the binoculars and reached for my logbook, finally ready to document what I'd observed. But as I opened to a fresh page, my pen hovering over the paper, I realized I had no idea how to explain what I'd seen in language that would make sense to anyone who read my reports. How do you write that something impossible was walking through the forest and that it seemed to know exactly where you were? I spent the day staring at those broken branches through my binoculars, trying to convince myself there might be some other explanation for the damage I'd found. Strong winds, maybe, or a sick bear that had climbed higher than usual and brought down the limbs while falling. But the pattern was too consistent, too deliberate. Something had passed through that forest with enough force to snap branches 6 inches thick, and it had been moving in a straight line toward my position. By afternoon, I'd gone through my emergency supplies twice, checking everything from my first aid kit to the battery levels in my flashlights. The flare gun sat on the desk next to my logbook, its orange plastic shell bright against the dark wood. I'd loaded it with a fresh cartridge and positioned 3 backup flares within easy reach. The rational part of my mind kept insisting this was overkill, that I was preparing for something that probably didn't exist. But my hands moved through the preparations anyway, driven by an instinct I couldn't ignore. The debate about leaving had started around noon and continued through the afternoon. I could pack my gear, lock up the cabin, and be back in Seattle by evening. Tell my supervisor I'd come down with something, take a few sick days, let someone else cover the tower until this rotation ended. It would be easy to explain, and nobody would question a fire lookout needing time off during the quiet season. But every time I started toward my duffel bag, something stopped me. Maybe it was 8 years of professional pride, or maybe it was the knowledge that running away wouldn't change what I'd seen. The creature, if that's what it was, would still be out there in the forest. Other hikers might wander into its territory without any warning. And there was David to consider, stationed 15 miles south with no idea that something might be moving through these mountains. I tried reaching Mount Pilchuck twice during the afternoon, keying the microphone and calling David's station. Both times I got nothing but static. Radio conditions could be unpredictable in the mountains, and David might have been away from his cabin doing equipment maintenance or afternoon observations. Still, the silence felt wrong after days of regular contact. As evening approached, I set up my observation station more carefully than I had on previous nights. The high-powered binoculars went on their tripod mount, aimed northwest, and focused for the distance where I expected the light to appear. I positioned my backup pair of binoculars on the desk next to my logbook, along with a small LED flashlight covered with red tape to preserve my night vision. The flare gun sat loaded and ready, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against something that size. The radio stayed tuned to David's frequency, volume turned up enough that I'd hear any transmission immediately. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing at the speaker, hoping for the familiar crackle of his voice, checking in with an evening report. But the radio remained silent except for occasional bursts of atmospheric static. Darkness settled over the forest earlier than usual, thick clouds blocking most of the starlight and making the tree line blend into a solid wall of black. I completed my standard rotation around the cabin, checking each quadrant through the windows, but visibility was poor enough that I could barely make out the nearest ridgeline. The northwest quadrant looked like a void, offering no hint of what might be moving through those trees. By 10 o'clock, I had everything ready and positioned myself at the desk, with the binoculars trained on the area where the light typically appeared. My logbook lay open to a fresh page, pen ready to record whatever I observed. The previous night's entries filled 3 pages with detailed descriptions of timing, location, and behavior patterns. Tonight's observations would either confirm my fears or prove that whatever was out there had moved on to some other part of the forest. At exactly 10:15, the blue glow flickered to life between the trees. My stomach dropped as I focused the binoculars and realized how much closer it had come. The distance that had been 3 miles on the first night, then roughly 2.5 miles the previous evening, was now clearly less than 2 miles. The light appeared brighter and more distinct, no longer requiring careful adjustment of the binoculars to bring into focus. Through the high-powered lenses, I could see details of the creature that had been invisible from greater distances. Its proportions looked even more wrong up close. The arms hung almost to the ground, too long for any normal humanoid form, ending in hands that seemed oversized even for limbs that length. Its head appeared small relative to the rest of its body, giving it an insect-like quality that made my skin crawl. The thing moved through the forest with that same jerky, unnatural gait I'd observed before, but from this distance I could see the deliberate nature of its movement more clearly. It wasn't wandering randomly through the trees. The creature was following a specific path, navigating around the massive Douglas firs and western red cedars with purpose and direction. Each step looked calculated, as if it knew exactly where it wanted to go. Most disturbing was how it occasionally stopped moving and turned directly toward my tower. During these pauses, the blue glow from its eyes seemed to intensify, casting enough light to illuminate the ground around it and create eerie shadows among the tree trunks. The sensation of being watched and acknowledged was overwhelming, even across nearly 2 miles of dense forest. Whatever this thing was, it knew I was up here observing it. I lowered the binoculars and tried the radio again, keying the microphone with hands that shook slightly. "Mount Pilchuck, this is Cascade Ridge. David, are you there? I really need to talk to you, man. Over." Static filled the cabin for 30 seconds before I tried again. "David, this is James. Please respond if you're receiving this. It's important. Over." Nothing but empty static. Either David's radio was malfunctioning or he'd left his tower for some reason. The isolation hit me like a physical weight, the realization that I was completely alone up here, with no way to contact the outside world. My cell phone had no signal this deep in the mountains, and the radio to headquarters only worked during business hours unless there was an actual emergency to report. But what kind of emergency was this? I could imagine the conversation with dispatch. "There's a creature with glowing eyes walking through the forest toward my position. They'd probably send a psychiatric evaluation team instead of backup." I raised the binoculars again and tracked the creature as it continued moving through the trees. Its path was taking it roughly in my direction, though not in a straight line. The thing seemed to be following the natural contours of the terrain, choosing routes that avoided the steepest slopes and thickest undergrowth. The movement pattern suggested intelligence and planning rather than simple animal behavior. As I watched, the creature stopped next to a massive cedar tree and turned toward my tower again. This time, it remained motionless for several minutes, those blue eyes blazing in the darkness like twin beacons. The intensity of its focus made me duck slightly below the window level, even though logic insisted it couldn't possibly see me at this distance through the cabin's dark interior. When I looked again, the thing had resumed moving, but its path had changed. Instead of the meandering route it had been following, the creature was now heading more directly toward my position. Not in a straight line. The terrain wouldn't allow that, but with less deviation from the most direct possible course. My hands were shaking badly enough that the binoculars became difficult to hold steady. I lowered them and flexed my fingers, trying to regain control. 8 years of fire watch work had prepared me for many situations: lost hikers, medical emergencies, equipment failures, even the occasional drunk camper who needed to be talked down from doing something stupid. But nothing in my training covered what to do when something impossible was walking through the forest toward your position. The flare gun felt solid and reassuring when I picked it up, though I had no idea how effective it would be against a creature that size. The emergency flares were designed to signal for help over long distances, not to serve as weapons. But the bright, magnesium burn might be enough to scare off whatever was out there, assuming it was something that could be scared. Through the remainder of the night, I tracked the creature's steady progress through the forest. It moved with patience and determination, never rushing but never stopping for long. The path became more direct as the hours passed, confirming that my tower was definitely its destination. By 3 in the morning, I estimated it had covered more than half the distance from its starting point. The blue glow disappeared just before dawn, as it had on previous nights, but this time the creature's final position was close enough that I could pinpoint its location without binoculars. Roughly 1 mile from the base of my tower, hidden somewhere in the dense old growth that covered the lower slopes of the ridge. I stayed at the observation post as daylight filtered through the forest canopy, scanning the area where the light had vanished. The trees looked peaceful and normal in the morning light, showing no signs that anything unusual had passed through during the night. But I knew the creature was still out there, probably resting during daylight hours before resuming its approach when darkness returned. The thought of spending another night alone in the tower, with that thing less than a mile away, made my breathing shallow and my hands shake. But the alternative, abandoning my post and leaving the forest unprotected, felt like the worst choice. If this creature was real, if it posed a threat to hikers or other people in the area, then someone needed to monitor its movements and report its location. I just wasn't sure how much longer I could handle being that someone. My hands refused to stay steady as I went through my emergency supplies for the 3rd time that morning, counting and recounting items that hadn't changed since my previous inventory. 3 emergency flares, check. Extra batteries for the LED lantern, check. First aid kit with bandages, antiseptic, and basic medications, check. Water purification tablets, emergency food rations, backup radio batteries. Everything accounted for, everything in working order. But the repetitive checking gave my mind something to focus on besides the memory of those blue eyes staring up from the forest floor. The radio equipment received the same obsessive attention. I tested every frequency, adjusted the antenna multiple times, and verified that all backup power sources were functioning properly. Static crackled through the speaker as I swept through channels, searching for any sign that the outside world still existed beyond these mountains. The normal chatter from ranger stations and highway patrol felt reassuring, proof that civilization continued while I sat isolated in my tower with something impossible prowling the forest below. By noon, I'd reorganized my entire cabin twice and cleaned equipment that didn't need cleaning. The binoculars got fresh lens cloths. The logbook received new entries documenting weather conditions and visibility, and I even swept the cabin floor, despite having done the same thing the previous evening. Staying busy kept my thoughts from dwelling on what I'd witnessed, though every few minutes I found myself checking the northwest windows for any sign of movement in the tree line. The afternoon radio check with David came at 2 o'clock, his familiar voice cutting through the static with welcome normalcy. I keyed the microphone and tried to sound professional rather than desperate. Mount Pilchuck. This is Cascade Ridge. Afternoon check-in. Everything quiet here. Roger that, Cascade Ridge. Good to hear from you, James. How are you holding up after last night's excitement? David's tone carried a careful neutrality that hadn't been there during our previous conversations. The pause before excitement suggested he'd been thinking about our midnight radio call and wasn't sure what to make of it. Fine. Everything's fine. Just maintaining normal watch protocols. That's good to hear. Listen, James, I've been talking to some of the other lookouts about unusual wildlife activity this season. Johnson up at Granite Peak mentioned seeing some strange stuff too. Sometimes the isolation gets to people, especially during the quiet periods. Nothing wrong with that, but maybe you should consider taking some personal time if things are getting too stressful. His suggestion hit me like cold water. David thought I was cracking up, losing my grip on reality after too many days alone in the mountains. The reasonable tone he used, the same voice he'd employ to talk someone down from a ledge, made it clear that my credibility had evaporated completely. I appreciate the concern, but I'm fine, just doing my job. Of course. But if you need anything, or if you want to head down early from this rotation, nobody would think less of you. These mountain assignments can be tough on anyone. Thanks, David. I'll keep that in mind. Cascade Ridge out. I set the microphone back in its cradle and stared at the radio for several minutes, processing the implications of that conversation. David had written off my reports as stress-induced hallucinations. If I called him tonight with news that the creature had reached my tower, he'd probably contact my supervisor and recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation. The isolation had closed around me completely, leaving me alone with whatever was moving through the forest below. The afternoon stretched endlessly as I waited for darkness, dreading what I might see but unable to stop myself from preparing for it. I loaded the flare gun with a fresh cartridge and positioned 3 backup flares on the desk within easy reach. The bright orange cylinders looked inadequate against what I'd observed through the binoculars, but they were the only weapons available. Emergency flares burned at nearly 2,000 degrees and produced blinding light that might be enough to scare off anything that relied on night vision. I arranged the flares around the cabin in strategic locations, placing one near each window and keeping the loaded flare gun on the desk next to my observation equipment. The preparations felt both necessary and futile, like building a sandcastle against an incoming tide. If the creature wanted to reach me, 70 feet of steel tower and a few emergency flares wouldn't stop something that could break 6-inch tree branches without slowing down. As evening approached, I positioned myself at the northwest window with the binoculars already focused on the tree line below. The forest looked peaceful in the fading light. Just the usual collection of massive Douglas firs and western red cedars swaying gently in the evening breeze. No movement beyond the occasional bird or small animal rustling through the undergrowth. Nothing to suggest that anything dangerous lurked in those shadows. Darkness settled over the mountains earlier than usual, thick clouds blocking most of the starlight and reducing visibility to barely 50 yards. I completed my standard rotation around the cabin, checking each quadrant through the windows, but the poor conditions made detailed observation impossible. The northwest quadrant appeared as a solid wall of black, offering no hint of what might be approaching through those trees. At exactly 9:30, the blue glow flickered to life. This time I didn't need binoculars to see it. The twin points of light blazed in the darkness like electric beacons, close enough that I could make out their movement with naked eyes. My stomach dropped as I realized the creature had covered the remaining distance during the day, positioning itself somewhere in the forest directly below my tower. I grabbed the high-powered binoculars and focused on the lights, my hands shaking so badly that the image jumped and wavered. When I finally managed to steady the view, what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The thing emerged from the tree line at the base of my tower, stepping into the small clearing that surrounded the steel support structure. Up close, its impossible proportions became even more horrifying. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall, its elongated limbs giving it an insect-like quality that violated every natural law I understood. Arms hung almost to its knees, ending in hands that appeared oversized even for limbs that length. Its torso seemed too narrow to support that height, creating an overall silhouette that looked wrong from every angle. The blue glow emanated from 2 points where eyes should be, casting enough light to illuminate the ground around the tower base and create eerie shadows among the support beams. In that pale radiance, I could see details of the creature's form that made my skin crawl. Its head appeared small relative to the rest of its body, perched on a neck that seemed too thin to support it. The limbs moved with that same jerky, unnatural motion I'd observed from a distance, as if the thing was learning to operate a body that didn't quite belong to it. For nearly an hour, the creature circled the base of my tower with methodical precision. It moved slowly around the perimeter, occasionally stopping to examine the steel support beams more closely. The deliberate nature of its inspection was terrifying. This wasn't random animal behavior or simple curiosity. The thing was studying the tower's structure, learning about its construction and looking for potential weaknesses. I kept perfectly still during its circuit, afraid that any movement might draw its attention upward. The cabin's windows faced all 4 directions, giving me a clear view as the creature completed its rounds, but I tried to stay back from the glass and avoid creating silhouettes that might be visible from below. My breathing became shallow and controlled, each exhale carefully muffled to avoid making any sound that might carry down through the tower's steel framework. The most terrifying moment came when the creature stopped directly beneath my position and placed both hands on the main support beams. Its fingers wrapped around the steel with apparent ease, long digits curling completely around structural elements that were 6 inches thick. For several seconds, the thing simply held the beams, as if testing their thickness and strength. Then it began to shake them. The entire tower swayed gently under the creature's experimental pressure, steel groaning softly as the framework absorbed forces it wasn't designed to handle. My cabin rocked slightly from side to side, enough motion that I had to grip the walls for support and steady myself against the desk. Books shifted on their shelves, and the radio equipment creaked as the mounting brackets flexed with the movement. The creature applied pressure methodically, testing different support points and gauging the tower's response to various stresses. It seemed to understand exactly what it was doing, as if it possessed engineering knowledge about structural weak points and load-bearing capacity. Each test lasted only a few seconds, but the cumulative effect made the entire tower feel unstable and vulnerable. I watched through the window as the thing completed its evaluation, stepping back from the support beams and tilting its head upward. Those blue eyes blazed in the darkness like twin searchlights, their intensity so bright that I ducked reflexively below the window frame. The sensation of being observed and analyzed was overwhelming, even more powerful than when I'd watched it from miles away through binoculars. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the creature stood motionless beneath my tower, staring up at the cabin with unwavering focus. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, pressing down on me from below with an intelligence that was definitely not animal. Whatever this thing was, it knew I was up here. It understood that I'd been watching it for days, tracking its progress through the forest. Most disturbing of all, it seemed to be planning something. Just before dawn, the creature moved back toward the tree line with the same deliberate pace it had maintained throughout its inspection. But instead of disappearing immediately into the forest, it stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned back toward my tower one final time. Those blue eyes fixed on my window with laser-like intensity, holding my location for several long minutes before the thing finally stepped backward into the shadows and vanished. I remained frozen at the observation post long after the creature had gone, staring down at the empty clearing where it had conducted its methodical examination of my tower's defenses. The steel support beams looked normal in the pale morning light, showing no obvious damage from the creature's testing. But I could still feel the memory of that gentle, swaying motion, the sense that my refuge had been found inadequate for whatever the thing was planning. The radio remained silent on David's frequency, and I didn't bother trying to contact him with another report that would only convince him further that I'd lost my mind. Instead, I opened my logbook to a fresh page and began documenting what I'd observed, writing down every detail I could remember about the creature's appearance, behavior, and apparent intelligence. As I wrote, one thought kept returning with increasing urgency. The thing hadn't been trying to climb my tower or break it down during its hour-long inspection. It had been learning about its structure and stability, gathering information for some future purpose. The question that terrified me was what it planned to do with that knowledge. 2 hours passed before I worked up the nerve to leave my tower. The creature had vanished with the first rays of sunlight, melting back into the forest shadows like it had never existed. I checked and rechecked my equipment before making the descent. The flare gun went into my jacket pocket, loaded and ready, with 2 backup flares secured in my belt pack. My radio clipped to my vest, volume turned high enough that I'd hear any incoming transmissions immediately. The decision to go down felt both necessary and terrifying, but I couldn't spend another day wondering what that thing had been doing at the base of my tower. The 70 metal steps felt different going down than they had during my routine climbs over the past 8 years. Each footfall rang hollow against the steel framework, the sound carrying further than I wanted through the quiet morning air. My hands gripped the railings tighter than necessary, knuckles white against the painted metal. By the time I reached the bottom platform, sweat had soaked through my shirt despite the cool morning temperature. The clearing around my tower's base showed obvious signs of the creature's overnight visit. Footprints marked the soft earth in a rough circle, following the same path I'd watched it take during its methodical inspection. The prints themselves made me stop and stare, trying to process what I was seeing. Each footprint stretched nearly 2 feet long and maybe 8 inches wide, but the proportions looked wrong for anything that should be walking upright. The impressions were deeper at the heel and toe, suggesting a gait that put most weight on the extremities rather than distributing it evenly like human feet. Most disturbing were the marks at the front of each print, 5 distinct gouges where toes had dug into the earth, but the spacing and depth suggested claws rather than normal digits. I knelt next to the clearest print and held my own boot above it for comparison. My size 11 hiking boot looked like a child's shoe next to the creature's track. The depth of the impression in the packed earth indicated something far heavier than a human, probably close to 400 pounds based on how deeply the prints had sunk into ground that barely showed my own footsteps. Following the trail away from my tower led me into dense old-growth forest where the canopy blocked most of the morning light. Massive Douglas firs and western red cedars created natural corridors between their trunks, and the creature had moved through these spaces with apparent ease. Broken branches marked its passage, not the careful navigation of something trying to move quietly, but the casual destruction of obstacles that happened to be in its way. 6-inch thick fir branches hung at odd angles, snapped clean through by something passing underneath. The breaks looked fresh, sap still bleeding from the wounds in the bark. I reached up to examine one of the damaged limbs, noting that the break point was nearly 8 feet above the forest floor. Whatever had caused this damage was tall enough to snap branches that would be well above my head. The trail led deeper into the forest, winding between the massive tree trunks in a roughly straight line. I followed it carefully, pausing every few yards to check for fresh footprints or additional signs of disturbance. The creature's path avoided the steepest terrain and thickest undergrowth, but it didn't deviate much from a direct route through the trees. The consistency suggested purpose rather than random wandering. After 20 minutes of tracking, I found more extensive damage to the forest canopy. A cluster of trees showed broken branches at multiple levels, creating gaps in the overhead cover that let shafts of sunlight reach the forest floor. The destruction looked like something large had pushed through this area with considerable force, bringing down limbs and smaller trees that had blocked its path. I moved more cautiously, as the trail led into a small depression between 2 ridges. an area where the old growth gave way to slightly younger trees and thicker undergrowth. The changed vegetation allowed more light to penetrate, but it also provided more cover for anything that might be hiding nearby. My hand stayed close to the flare gun in my jacket pocket, though I doubted it would be much protection against something that could break thick tree branches without slowing down. The smell hit me before I saw anything else, a sickly, sweet odor that made my stomach lurch. Decomposition mixed with something else, something metallic that I recognized from childhood hunting trips with my father. Blood, and lots of it. 30 minutes after leaving my tower, I found what the creature had been protecting. The body lay in a small clearing, maybe 40 yards from where the trail had led me. Even from a distance, I could see that this wasn't a natural death or normal animal predation. The hiker, it had to be a hiker based on the scattered gear, had been torn apart with a violence that made my vision blur around the edges. I forced myself closer, stepping carefully around the debris field that surrounded the body. A backpack hung in shreds from a nearby tree branch, its contents scattered across 20 yards of forest floor. Clothing, food packages, camping gear, and personal items created a chaotic spread that suggested the attack had been both frenzied and thorough. The victim appeared to be male, probably in his 30s, based on the clothing and gear visible among the scattered remains. His hiking boots sat neatly together against a fallen log, almost like he'd taken them off to rest. But everything else about the scene screamed violence and terror. Deep gouges in the nearby trees marked where claws had raked the bark, some cuts reaching 8 feet above ground. The pattern suggested the creature had used the trees for leverage during its attack, or maybe the victim had tried to climb to safety before being pulled down. Chunks of bark littered the ground beneath the damaged trees, mixed with torn fabric and other debris. I couldn't bring myself to examine the body closely, but even from several yards away I could see evidence of massive trauma. The kind of injuries that would require incredible strength to inflict, far beyond what any normal predator could manage. This wasn't a bear attack or mountain lion kill. This was something else entirely. The worst part was realizing how long this person had been here. The decomposition and scattered condition of the remains suggested days, maybe a week. While I'd been watching that blue light moving through the forest, thinking it might be campers with unusual equipment, this hiker had already been dead. The creature hadn't been exploring or hunting. It had been guarding its kill. Guilt crashed over me like a physical blow. If I'd investigated sooner, if I'd trusted my instincts instead of looking for rational explanations, maybe this person would still be alive. I'd had 3 nights to act, 3 opportunities to radio for help or hike down to check on what I'd been observing. Instead, I'd convinced myself it was probably nothing serious while someone died less than 3 miles from my tower. My hands shook as I reached for the radio clipped to my vest. This couldn't wait for evening check-ins or normal protocols. The Rangers needed to know about this immediately, and they needed to mount a search for whatever had killed this hiker. David's skepticism about my reports would evaporate once he saw what I'd found. Physical evidence this obvious couldn't be dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations. The radio crackled as I keyed the microphone, but before I could speak, a branch snapped somewhere behind me. The sound cut through the forest quiet like a gunshot, freezing my blood and making every muscle in my body tense. I turned slowly, already knowing what I would see but hoping desperately that I was wrong. The creature stood 15 feet away, positioned between me and the path I'd used to reach this clearing. In full daylight, its impossible proportions looked even more horrifying than they had through binoculars in darkness. 8 feet of elongated limbs and wrong angles, arms hanging almost to the ground, that insect-like head perched on a neck too thin to support it. Those blue eyes blazed with an intensity that made my vision blur, like staring directly into welding torches. The glow seemed even brighter in daylight, casting visible rays that cut through the forest shadows and made the air shimmer around the creature's face. Up close, the light had a quality that hurt to look at directly, forcing me to squint and turn my head slightly to avoid the worst of the glare. The thing didn't move immediately, just stood there watching me with that unwavering focus I'd felt from miles away. Its presence filled the clearing with a wrongness that made my skin crawl and my breathing shallow. Everything about its form violated natural law. The proportions, the way it held itself upright, the casual strength evident in its oversized hands. I tried to reach for the flare gun in my jacket pocket, but my hand moved too slowly, made clumsy by terror and the knowledge that I was completely outmatched. The creature's head tilted slightly as it tracked my movement, those burning eyes following my hand with predatory awareness. Before I could clear the flare gun from my pocket, the thing lunged forward with speed that shouldn't have been possible for something that size. One massive arm swept across my chest like a baseball bat, lifting me completely off my feet and sending me flying backward through the air. The impact drove all air from my lungs and filled my vision with white stars. I hit a large Douglas fir trunk with enough force to shake loose bark and small branches, the radio shattering against the tree as my body slammed into the rough surface. I crumpled to the forest floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come, pain shooting through my ribs and back where I'd struck the tree. The world spun around me as I tried to focus, tried to move, tried to do anything besides lie there, helpless, while that thing approached. Through blurred vision, I watched the creature advance with deliberate slowness, taking its time now that I was down and unable to run. Those blue eyes never left my face, and I could swear I saw something like satisfaction in their electric glow. Its elongated fingers flexed as it moved closer, claws extending from the tips like a cat preparing to strike. The thing was savoring this moment, enjoying my terror and helplessness. Whatever intelligence burned behind those blazing eyes, it understood exactly what it was doing to me. And it liked it. The sharp crack of a rifle shot exploded through the forest, the sound bouncing off tree trunks and fading into echoes that seemed to go on forever. The creature jerked backward like someone had yanked it with invisible cables, dark fluid spreading across its chest in a stain that looked black against its pale form. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision and make sense of what had just happened. The thing that had been advancing on me with predatory satisfaction now stumbled backward, those blazing blue eyes flickering as if someone had dimmed their power source. A second rifle crack split the air, then a third, each shot driving the creature further away from where I lay, crumpled against the Douglas fir. David emerged from the tree line with his hunting rifle raised, the barrel still smoking from the shots he'd fired. He moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent years hunting in these mountains, keeping the weapon trained on the creature as it retreated deeper into the forest. The thing let out a sound that made my teeth ache, part shriek, part roar, but with harmonics that no natural animal could produce. The noise cut through the forest like broken glass, sending birds exploding from their perches and making every small creature within hearing distance go completely silent. "Stay down, James," David called, without taking his eyes off the retreating figure. "Don't move until I'm sure it's gone." The creature stumbled between the massive tree trunks, leaving a trail of that dark fluid on bark and undergrowth. Its movements had lost that fluid, unnatural grace I'd observed through my binoculars. Now it moved like something badly injured, each step unsteady and wrong. Those blue eyes still blazed in the forest shadows, but their intensity had dimmed considerably, and they no longer seemed focused on me with that terrifying intelligence. I tried to push myself up from the forest floor, but pain shot through my ribs like electric shocks. My back felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it, and breathing came in short, careful gasps that didn't quite fill my lungs. The radio that had been clipped to my vest lay in pieces against the tree trunk, its plastic housing shattered and wires exposed. "David," I managed to croak, my voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. "How did you—" "Radio went dead yesterday evening," he said, still tracking the creature's retreat through his rifle scope. "Then this morning the ranger station called about a missing hiker in this area. Thomas Wright, been gone 5 days. When I couldn't raise you on the radio, I figured I better drive over and check things out." The creature had vanished completely into the deep forest, but David kept his rifle ready for another full minute before finally lowering the barrel. He moved toward me carefully, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement while keeping one hand on his weapon. "Jesus, James, what the hell did that thing do to you?" David knelt beside me and helped me sit up against the tree trunk, his hands gentle but efficient as he checked for obvious injuries. My shirt had torn during the impact, and I could feel blood seeping from scrapes where the rough bark had gouged my back. Everything hurt, but nothing felt broken beyond repair. "Threw me," I said, accepting David's help to get to my feet. "Hit me like a freight train and sent me flying." "That was no bear," David said flatly, looking toward where the creature had disappeared. "I've seen plenty of bears, shot a few when they got too aggressive around the lookouts. Never seen anything move like that thing did." My legs felt unsteady, but David's grip on my arm kept me upright as we both stared at the forest where the creature had vanished. Dark spots on the ground marked where its blood had dripped, creating a trail that led deeper into the old growth. The fluid looked wrong somehow, too dark and thick to be normal blood. "You believe me now," I said, and it wasn't a question. Hard to argue with something that tries to rip your head off. David adjusted his grip on the rifle and looked around the clearing with new awareness. "Show me what you found." The body. I led him to where the hiker's remains lay scattered among the debris of camping gear and torn clothing. David's face went pale as he took in the extent of the violence, the deep claw marks in nearby trees, the way the victim had been torn apart with inhuman strength. "Thomas Wright," David said quietly, reading information from a scattered driver's license. 34 years old, address in Everett. Reported missing 5 days ago when he didn't return from a solo backpacking trip. David examined the scene with the methodical attention of someone who'd worked search and rescue operations before. He photographed everything with his phone camera, documented the scattered gear, and noted details about the attack patterns without disturbing evidence more than necessary. "This explains the patrol requests from the Rangers," he said, kneeling near the backpack remains. "They've been searching the main trails and established camping areas. Never would have found him out here." I explained everything while David documented the scene. The blue lights I'd observed for 3 nights, watching the creature move closer to my tower. The way it had studied the structural supports like it was planning something. David listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification about timing or distances, but never questioning the basic facts of what I'd experienced. "That thing was intelligent," I told him as we stood at the edge of the debris field. "Not just animal smart. It knew I was watching it, knew where my tower was located, understood how to test the support beams for weak points. When it looked at me, I could tell it was thinking, planning." "I believe you," David said, checking his rifle to make sure it was still loaded. "What I saw moving through those trees wasn't natural. The way it covered ground, the size of it, that sound it made when I shot it. Nothing in these mountains moves like that." David's radio had survived better than mine, and he used it to contact the ranger station with news about finding Thomas Wright's body. Within 20 minutes, the forest filled with voices as search and rescue teams, park rangers, and police investigators converged on our location. Helicopters circled overhead, looking for landing zones in the dense canopy, while ground teams hiked in from established trail access points. The next several hours passed in a blur of official interviews and evidence documentation. I gave my statement to 3 different people: a park ranger, a county sheriff's deputy, and a state police investigator. Each time I told the same story about observing unusual lights, tracking movement through the forest, and being attacked by something that wasn't any known animal species. The officials maintained professional courtesy while taking my statement, but I could see doubt creeping into their expressions when I described the creature's impossible proportions and obvious intelligence. They documented my injuries, photographed the claw marks on nearby trees, and made detailed notes about the victim's condition, but the creature itself had vanished without leaving conclusive evidence of its existence. Mr. Patterson, the state investigator said after my third interview, you've been through significant trauma. Physical injuries aside, witnessing a scene like this can have lasting psychological effects. Are you receiving any counseling or medical attention for what you've experienced? The question carried implications that made my stomach tighten. They were already building a narrative about stress-induced hallucinations and trauma responses, looking for ways to explain away the parts of my story that didn't fit their understanding of normal predator behavior. David corroborated everything I'd told them, including his own sighting of the creature during the attack. His statement carried more weight with the officials. He hadn't been isolated for days, hadn't reported previous unusual sightings, and had approached the situation from outside, rather than being personally involved from the beginning. I saw something attacking James, David told the investigators. Something big, upright, moving wrong. I shot it 3 times center mass and it ran off, making sounds no bear or mountain lion could make. Whatever killed this hiker, it's still out there. The search teams found the trail of dark fluid leading away from the clearing, but it disappeared after a few hundred yards where the ground became too rocky to hold prints or blood. Dogs brought in from the sheriff's department lost the scent at a creek crossing, and aerial searches revealed no signs of movement in the surrounding forest. By late afternoon, the body had been removed and the scene processed completely. Thomas Wright would receive a proper burial, and his family would have answers about what had happened to him, even if those answers raised more questions about what kind of predator could inflict such damage. My supervisor arrived with the last wave of officials, a practical woman named Sandra who'd managed fire lookout operations for 15 years. She examined my injuries and listened to abbreviated versions of the morning's events from both me and David. James, she said after reviewing the official reports, you've been through hell. The department is recommending administrative leave while you recover from this incident. Full pay, medical coverage, whatever counseling you need. Take as much time as necessary. The recommendation felt like a gentle dismissal, a way to remove me from active duty while they decided how to handle someone who'd reported impossible encounters with unknown creatures. Administrative leave would keep me away from the towers and out of situations where I might file more unusual reports that could embarrass the department. I'm fine to continue my rotation, I said, though even as the words came out, I wasn't sure I meant them. This thing is still out there. Someone needs to keep watching for it. The Rangers will increase patrols in this area, Sandra replied. We'll have extra personnel monitoring radio traffic and conducting regular welfare checks on all lookout stations. You've done your job, James. You found the victim and reported the threat. Let other people handle it from here. David walked me back to my tower as the last of the officials packed up their equipment and prepared to leave the forest. The creature's blood had dried on bark and undergrowth, leaving dark stains that would probably remain visible for weeks. Deep gouges in tree trunks marked where claws had raked the wood, scars that would last for years. You going to take the leave? David asked as we climbed the 70 metal steps to my cabin. Don't know yet, I admitted. Part of me wants to get as far away from here as possible. But part of me thinks someone needs to keep watching, keep documenting what happens next. That thing took 3 rifle shots and kept moving, David said. I've dropped elk with less than that. Whatever it was, it's tough as hell, and probably not real happy about getting shot. David helped me secure my equipment and pack essential gear before heading back to his own station. The forest had returned to its normal afternoon quiet, just the usual sounds of birds and small animals going about their business. No sign remained of the morning's violence except for those dark stains and claw marks that the investigators had photographed and measured. As evening approached, I found myself at the northwest window with my binoculars, scanning the tree line where the creature had disappeared hours earlier. The forest looked peaceful and empty, just dense old growth swaying in the evening breeze. Nothing moved between the massive trunks except shadows and occasional wildlife. But I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in those trees, something was watching me back. I sat at my desk arranging my logbook and equipment for what felt like the 100th time in 4 days. 3 weeks away from the tower had left me restless and jumpy, unable to settle into the routines that had sustained me through 8 years of fire watch duty. Every small sound made me look up from whatever task I was pretending to focus on, and I'd caught myself checking the northwest windows more often than any professional observer should need to. The decision to return hadn't been easy. Sandra had made it clear that my administrative leave could stretch as long as necessary, with full pay and benefits while I processed the traumatic events I'd experienced. The department psychologist had recommended at least 2 more weeks of counseling before considering a return to isolated duty. David had called twice to suggest I take a different assignment, maybe something closer to civilization where backup was measured in minutes rather than hours. But I couldn't let fear end a career I'd built over nearly a decade. The mountains had been my refuge from the chaos of urban life, and I wasn't ready to give that up because of one encounter with something that defied explanation. Whatever had killed Thomas Wright was still out there, probably somewhere in the vast wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Running away wouldn't change that fact or make the threat disappear. The first 3 days back had passed without incident. David checked in twice daily instead of his usual evening call, and ranger patrols had increased significantly in the area around my tower. I'd spotted their vehicles on the access road below and heard their radio chatter during afternoon equipment checks. The extra presence felt reassuring, even though part of me knew that a few additional patrols wouldn't make much difference if something like that creature decided to return. My injuries had healed well enough during the leave period. The worst bruising had faded to yellow stains across my ribs and back, and the scrapes from hitting the Douglas fir had left only thin scars that barely showed unless I looked for them. Physically, I felt ready to handle the job again. Mentally was another story, but I'd been telling myself that would improve with time and routine. Each evening I'd conducted my standard forest scans without seeing anything unusual. No blue lights, no movement in the distant tree line, no signs that anything larger than deer and elk inhabited the wilderness below. The forest had returned to its normal appearance, endless green canopy broken by ridgelines and peaks, peaceful and empty under the October sky. I'd almost convinced myself that David's rifle shots had either killed the creature or driven it far enough away that it wouldn't return to this area. The ranger station had officially classified Thomas Wright's death as an animal attack by an unknown predator, possibly a bear with unusual aggressive behavior or a mountain lion of exceptional size. The investigators had documented the claw marks and unusual aspects of the attack, but without additional evidence or witnesses, they'd filed the case as an isolated incident requiring increased wildlife monitoring in the region. David had been more direct in his assessment. "That thing was like nothing I've ever seen," he'd told me during one of his check-in calls. "Shot it 3 times center mass and it kept moving like I'd thrown rocks at it. Whatever it was, it's either dead or long gone, because nothing that tough would stick around after taking that kind of damage." I wanted to believe him, but something about the creature's obvious intelligence made me doubt it would simply disappear after being wounded. The way it had studied my tower's structural supports, the methodical manner in which it had circled the base, the clear awareness it had shown when looking directly at my observation post. None of that suggested an animal that would flee and never return. It suggested something that would remember, learn, and possibly plan. The radio equipment had been upgraded during my absence, replaced with more powerful units that could reach the ranger station directly rather than relying on relay through other lookout towers. Emergency protocols had been updated to require immediate contact with headquarters for any unusual wildlife sightings, and I'd been issued a satellite phone as backup communication in case the main radio failed. Evening approached with the same routine I'd followed for thousands of nights over the past 8 years. I moved around the cabin, checking each quadrant through the windows, noting weather conditions and visibility in my logbook, preparing equipment for the final scan before settling in for the night. The forest stretched away in all directions, just dark green shapes under a clear sky that promised good visibility after sunset. My binoculars sat mounted on their tripod, positioned for easy access to any quadrant that might need closer examination. The new radio hummed quietly on standby, volume adjusted to catch any incoming transmissions immediately. Everything felt normal and professional. Just another evening of routine observation in one of the most peaceful assignments in the fire service. At exactly 9:45, I positioned myself at the northwest window and began my systematic scan of the forest below. The area looked the same as it had for the past 3 nights. Dense old growth extending as far as my equipment could resolve, broken only by the occasional ridge or clearing that provided reference points for distance estimation. Nothing moved except the usual evening breeze shifting through the canopy. I almost missed it at first, just a faint flicker at the edge of my vision, while I swept the binoculars across the familiar terrain. When I swung back to check, my stomach dropped, as if I'd stepped off a cliff. A blue glow pulsed between the trees, in the same general area where I'd first spotted the creature 3 weeks earlier. The twin points of light blazed with the same electric intensity I remembered, cutting through the forest shadows like beacons. My hands started shaking as I adjusted the focus, hoping desperately that I was seeing some kind of optical illusion or equipment malfunction. The creature stood in a small clearing roughly 3 miles northwest of my position, clearly visible through the high-powered lenses. 8 feet of impossible proportions and wrong angles, arms hanging almost to the ground. That insect-like head tilted at an angle that suggested it was scanning the surrounding forest. Those blue eyes blazed with painful intensity, casting enough light to illuminate the ground around its feet and create shadows among nearby tree trunks. All my hopes that David's shots had killed it or driven it permanently away crumbled as I watched the thing move through the trees with that same unnatural gait I remembered. Jerky, deliberate steps that covered ground too quickly for something that size, navigating around massive Douglas firs and western red cedars without slowing or changing course. But as I tracked its movement and tried to estimate its path, something else caught my attention in my peripheral vision. Another blue glow flickered to life roughly 50 yards from the first creature, then a third even further away. I blinked hard and refocused the binoculars, hoping I was seeing reflections or some kind of lens distortion. 3 separate sets of blue eyes blazed in the forest below, moving through the trees with obvious coordination and purpose. Not random wandering or territorial patrol, but directed movement toward a specific destination. The creatures maintained their spacing as they navigated between tree trunks, occasionally stopping to wait for the others before continuing in the same general direction. I watched them for several minutes, trying to determine their intended path and destination. The group wasn't heading toward my tower as the original creature had done during its previous visits. Instead, they moved southeast through the forest, following terrain that would eventually lead them toward Mount Pilchuck and David's lookout station 15 miles away. My blood went cold as I realized what I was witnessing. These things hadn't returned to finish what the first one had started with me. They were moving toward David, who had shot their companion and driven it away wounded and bleeding. 3 of them, working together, heading directly toward someone who had no idea they were coming. I dropped the binoculars and lunged for the radio, my hands fumbling with the microphone as panic made my fingers clumsy. David needed to know about this immediately. He needed time to prepare, to contact the Rangers, to get backup or evacuation before those things reached his tower. Mount Pilchuck, Mount Pilchuck. This is Cascade Ridge, I said into the microphone, my voice cracking with urgency. David, respond immediately. Emergency traffic. But as I keyed the microphone and spoke David's call sign, movement in my peripheral vision made me look back toward the northwest window. What I saw made the words die in my throat and my grip loosen on the radio handset. All 3 creatures had stopped moving. 3 sets of blazing blue eyes had turned away from their southeastern path and now focused directly on my tower with laser-like intensity. Despite the distance, nearly 3 miles of dense forest, I felt their attention like a physical weight. The the same overwhelming sensation of being examined and evaluated that I'd experienced during my previous encounters. They knew exactly what I was doing. They understood that I was trying to warn their intended target, and they were watching me with the patient intelligence of predators who had learned from previous mistakes. The microphone hung in my trembling hand as those 6 points of blue light burned through the darkness between us, and I realized with horrible certainty that this time they had planned ahead.